Hey guys, in this video we've got the Grandmother here, so I'm going to go over the front panel, twist all the knobs, explain what everything does, and you'll get a feel for what the synth can do. But first, what is the Grandmother? It's a new synth from Moog. It's a semi-modular monophonic analog synthesizer. That's a mouthful. This synth is jam-packed with features, so here's how we're going to do it. There's 9 modules at the top here. I'm going to first cover the modules that have to do with the audio signal path. Then we're going to cover the modules that have to do with control voltages and modulation. And then finally, we're going to do the arpeggiator, sequencer, and keyboard stuff at the end. So we have 2 oscillators here, almost identical, except the first one goes down to 32 foot, second one to 16. So right now, I only have oscillator 1 going through my mixer. So if we can audition that, 32 foot, super bassy, going up to 4 foot. And then you have your triangle wave, which is what we're hearing now, sawtooth, pulse width at 50% duty cycle, so your standard square wave. And then you have your thin pulse width. And then if I turn off oscillator 1, I'm going to turn up oscillator 2. Same deal. Triangle. And sawtooth and square. Same waveform, same everything. Pretty neat. And then if we combine the 2 together, which is where all the fun happens, detune them. Get these chunky sounds. And then you can do one triangle and the other one more buzzy to get kind of a low fundamental. And then you have your hard sync feature. You also have pulse width modulation, but I'm not going to cover that until we get to the modulation section later. And up here, just a quick tour of the patch points. So you have the waveform output for both, so you can get the raw waveform coming out of here. Then you have volt per octave pitch control for both of them. And you have pulse width modulation control for oscillator 1 and linear FM for oscillator 2, so you can get those cool bell sound effects. All right, next up in the audio signal path, we go from the oscillator and we're routing ourselves into the mixer here. So the mixer is pretty self-explanatory. We have oscillator 1, oscillator 2, and white noise. So again, oscillator 1, oscillator 2, and our white noise. And up here, the 4 patch points allow you to override the 3 signals here. So you have the input for 1, 2, and 3. So effectively, you can feed any 3 signals into here that completely ignore the synth and just treat this as a standalone mixer if you wanted to. All right, so after the oscillators and noise get mixed up together, next they go through the low-pass filter, the moment we've all been waiting for. Ooh, that's creamy. That is creamy. Ooh, that's nice. Ah, it's so good. I could just do this all day. All right, let's crank up the resonance and maybe 50% resonance. You get these wow, like vocal sounds almost. Awesome. And like I said, the filter self-oscillates, so at some point, I'm going to start hearing a sine wave. And the controls here, you have positive and negative contribution from the ADSR. So once we get into the envelope section later, I'm going to demo that. In the middle here, we have a 3-way switch for keyboard tracking. So what this means is that the keyboard effectively sends a control voltage from low to high as you go up the keys. And that control voltage signal is used to control the cutoff frequency of the filter. Effectively, what that means is that the higher you play, the brighter the sound, which is more analogous to how kind of traditional acoustic instruments behave. So you have 3 settings here. Off is the default in the middle, and that means that regardless of what you play, the cutoff frequency doesn't change. You have a 1:2 ratio, which means that you're getting half the frequency change depending on what you change. So if you jump 2 octaves, you'll only get 1 octave's worth of filter change. And then 1:1 is literally, it follows you, effectively it's volt per octave tracking. So if you crank up the resonance, well, I'm just going to demo that now. Actually, let me turn off all my oscillators. So there's nothing coming through the mixer. All we're going to hear is the filter here. And since I have 1:1 keyboard tracking, let me crank that up so you can hear better. Perfect tracking. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention about the mixer. So if we jump back real quick, if you're at 12 o'clock, you're getting sort of optimal levels. They say as soon as you cross 1 o'clock, you're getting gentle distortion, and then the higher you raise it, you get more harsh distortion. So we can demo that now. Make sure my volume's in check. So we're getting a slightly more buzzy, distorted sound. So be careful with that. If you're looking for a smooth sound, make sure you're not cranking everything to the max. Whereas if you want a bit more bite and distortion, then feel free to go crazy. All right, so jumping back to the filter, we covered the knobs, and at the top here you have input and output jacks. So effectively, again, you can treat this like a standalone module where you can just feed a signal and then get the output straight out and ignore everything else. So you can patch it into a Eurorack modular or any other synth you want. Then you have cutoff frequency jack and envelope input amount. So basically voltage control over this knob here. All right, and finally, once the audio goes through the filter, it then goes into the output section, or the VCA, which stands for voltage controlled amplifier, which is just a way to control the volume of the sound giving some signal. So you have a standard volume knob, and then you have this 3-way rocker switch, which allows you to pick 3 different modes. The default is envelope, which means that the envelope is controlling the volume effectively. And then in the middle, you have this keyboard release one, which effectively, as soon as you press the key, it instantly goes on and the full sustain stage. So it ignores everything except the release knob. So then when you let go of the key, you get a release. And this is useful if you want to have the filter, since there's only one envelope, if you want to have a really interesting shape controlling just the filter, you don't want the volume to kind of impede that so you don't hear it. So you want the volume to go instantly up and then let the filter kind of do its thing with the envelope. And then finally, you have the drone mode, which effectively bypasses all controls over the VCA and just lets this knob control the volume. And this is a way to get droning sounds. So again, you get sounds without pressing anything, which is cool if you're doing experimental drone sounds, or even while you're patching something, you don't want to keep holding your hand down. So that's cool. And then at the top here, you have your standard VCA control. So you have the input signal, and then you have a reverb input, which we'll handle later, but effectively it's the signal that'll go into the reverb. And then you have your VCA amount input, which is your voltage control over the VCA. So again, you can use this as a standalone VCA module if you wanted to. And finally, down here, we go to the analog spring reverb effect. So let's just do a quick demo. It goes from all the way dry to all the way wet, whereas now we're just hearing the reverb signal, which gives you this really almost like a cello being played in the distance. Oh, I love the spring reverb. It just really adds a lot of interesting character to a sound. You can almost treat it, I treat it less like an effect and more kind of part of the synthesis engine. It adds a bit of glue in between sounds. When something sounds too sterile, it adds that little undertone. Next, let's go into the control-based modules, or the modulation stuff. All right, so let's start over with the aptly named modulation module here. So let me quickly explain how this works. Effectively, it's an LFO. You control the rate of the LFO with this knob here. And then you have 3 different destinations. You have the pitch amount of the oscillators, the cutoff frequency of the filter, and then you have the pulse width amount of the oscillators again. And in that case, they have to be set to a square wave or the pulse wave here. And then finally, you have the waveform of the LFO, which goes from sine wave, triangle, saw, and square. And the way it works is that these knobs set the maximum value that the modulation will go to. But you're not going to hear any effect because they work in tandem with the mod wheel here. So once the mod wheel is cranked to its maximum value, then whatever value the knobs have is the value the voltage will be, if that makes sense. So the way I like to do this is I crank the mod wheel all the way up. Then I set the knobs to the values I want the maximum range to be. And then you can control it with this and leave the knobs alone. So let's bring up pitch control. So you can go into crazy territory. But obviously the more practical one is to do vibrato, which is just a small change of pitch over time. So again, I like to set the extreme values here, and then we tone it down with the mod wheel and then bring it up to taste. Bring this down to make it a little more interesting. So that's pitch control. I'm going to bring that down. Let's demo cutoff frequency, same deal. classic wah-wah effect. So let's just do the extremes. This is the slowest rate. It's pretty slow. And let's go to the extreme. It definitely goes into audio rate because you can use this as an oscillator, which I'll demo shortly. And this is one trick I like to use to get that sort of AME, FME effect. If you want to add kind of bite and distortion to your sound. You sort of find that distorted sweet spot and then you can dial it in as you're playing. All right, so while we have it here, let's demo the different waveforms we have here. Switch over to triangle. Oh, my bad. I said triangle before, but it's actually a falling and raising sawtooth here. So this is the sine wave. This is the falling sawtooth, which is great for kind of rhythmic effects. What I like to do is crank the release here. So I'm jumping the gun. We're going to cover the ADSR later, but this gives you sort of a pseudo delay pedal effect here if you crank the release and give this kind of effect, this pulsing effect. You almost get that echo effect here. Obviously it's not the same because it's not adding up the repeats here, but you get the gist. All right, moving on. You can crank up the pitch as well, get some unique effects. All right, cranking those down. And finally, we have our square wave, which is useful to get sort of Nintendo-ish sounds if you assign it to pitch and you bring it really fast. Sort of like an arcade sound. All right, moving on. I'm going to bring this back to sawtooth. And then finally, we have the classic pulse width modulation. So remember to set your oscillators to square waves or pulse. I'm going to bring this up. So you can crank it to the point where it just completely squashes or reduces the duty cycle to the point where you can't hear the sound. So you want to make sure you dial it in so that doesn't happen. So the sweet spot seems to be around 12 o'clock here. So then you can get that classic pulse width modulation sound if you play a super bassy note, crank up 2 oscillators, and get a slow rate. And at the top of the LFO or modulation section, you have the rate input, which is the CV control to control this knob effectively. And this actually tracks volt per octave, which is super cool. So you can patch the keyboard control here to play the oscillator or the LFO like an oscillator. And I'm going to cover these in some tips and tricks videos I'm going to do in the future. So just want to keep this super brief. You have a sync input, so as soon as this receives a signal, it'll kind of reset the waveform, so you can sync your LFO that way. You have your sample and hold output, so sample and hold is not available anywhere on the front panel, so this is the only way to get it. And this effectively grabs the noise signal from here, feeds it into here, and then at the rate that this LFO is going, it'll sample the signal, not in a digital sense, but effectively it freezes the voltage. And because it's using noise, the noise is effectively random voltages. And if you sample or freeze random voltages at discrete times, you're effectively getting random discrete signals. And that's how you get that kind of R2D2 like bleep bloop effect going. All right, let me just patch that in so it don't sound too crazy here. So if I patch this into the cutoff frequency, you're gonna get that classic. Bring up some spring reverb and we're back in the 70s. And finally you have your wave output, which outputs the waveform here. And that's how you can get this as an oscillator and feed it into the mixer if you wanted to. All right, so continuing in the control voltage / modulation world, we jump from the modulation section up to this utilities module in the middle here. So this has a bunch of different features. At the top here, you have these 4 jacks, which are effectively mults. So what is a mult? Effectively, it just copies a signal over. Below that, you have a high-pass filter. This is a 6 dB slope high-pass filter. Super simple controls. You just have cutoff frequency effectively. And super simple, you just have input and output. By default, this isn't patched into anything, but you can, because every module effectively has ins and outs that you can kind of detach the module from the architecture, you could effectively just either patch the mixer output in through the high-pass filter and then through the low-pass filter, giving you a cascaded filter of high-pass followed by low-pass. And below that, you have this attenuverter, which just means that's an attenuator that can go plus or minus, and then you have inputs and outputs for that. So why would you want to use this? This allows you to scale a control voltage to some range. For example, if you had a signal coming from an external source that is a much bigger range than this can handle, or if you just wanted to reduce the effect of a modulation source. So for example, if you have an LFO going in and you wanted to patch it to something, but you didn't want the full range of the LFO contributing, you would run it to the attenuator and kind of reduce that volume of the control voltage, or invert it by making it negative so that as the LFO goes up, the signal that responds goes down. All right, so finally, the last module in our sort of utility category is this envelope generator at the end here, which is your standard ADSR envelope generator. You have your attack, decay, release, which are all time-based, and then you have this nice, really smooth sustain slider. And then at the top, you can treat this as a standalone ADSR module if you wanted to. So you have your trigger input, which is the gate signal that triggers the envelope generator. And then you have your positive and negative envelope outputs. You can get an inverted or a regular envelope signal. In this configuration with no attack, no decay, no release, everything is instant and the sustain level is max. So we're getting our max volume as soon as I push the key. But I can delay how long it takes for it to reach to that max level by increasing the attack. And then in its extreme setting, this is how slow it goes. Bring this back down. And then in order to hear the decay phase, which is the time it takes to go from max to sustain, we have to reduce the sustain level, otherwise we're not going to hear any effect. So if I bring the sustain all the way down for a dramatic effect, right now if I push the key, we're not going to hear anything, because effectively everything is shut down. There's no time between anything, and the sustain is all the way down, so the signal doesn't go anywhere. So if I increase the decay time, you get that kind of bouncy, plucky sound. And right now we're only controlling the volume with this, but you can assign the filter cutoff frequency to be controlled by this shape as well. And that's with this envelope amount knob, which I skipped over at the beginning. So you can add positive or negative contribution of the envelope generator. Ran out of keys. And if I increase the release time to its max value just to exaggerate the effect, you can have your notes sustain for a really long time. What I love to do is increase the spring reverb and then slow the attack and the release and get these really long pad sounds. So basically we've covered all these modules here. All that we're left with is this yellow guy here, which is your ARP/sequencer/keyboard kind of utility module, which goes in hand with these buttons here. So let's cover that now. All right, so you have two ways to kind of play back notes automatically. You have the arpeggiator and the sequencer. So let's demo the arpeggiator. So you have this switch in the middle here. If I switch it to the left, we turn on the arpeggiator, and then to actually activate it, you press play here. So obviously nothing is playing right now until I hold keys down, and that's how an arpeggiator works. It grabs the notes in your chord and kind of moves around them, given some settings here. All right, so we have this knob here which controls direction. So we have three choices: order, which maintains the order at which I played the notes down. Then you have forwards and backwards, so it goes up and down, and then you have random, so given all the notes you're playing, it'll pick random notes from that. And then you can choose between 1, 2, and 3 octaves, so you can go all the way up to 3 and then back down, etc. And then you have your rate knob here to control how fast it arpeggiates, so let's play that. Let's turn on the reverb to make it interesting. So I can make it up, down, and random. Switch it back to order, and then we can demo the 1, 2, and 3 octaves. This is 1 octave, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, And then I can make it upward, go up and all the way 3 octaves and then all the way back down. What's cool is that you have this hold button in the middle here. So if I push that down, it'll hold the notes for me so I don't have to keep my hands down. And then while it's holding, if I release all the keys and then push new keys, it'll kind of override that. So that's a good way to play different sequences of arpeggiatos without having to hold your hands down. So I'm super happy that they made the arpeggiator such that if you change chords and notes, it kind of keeps the rhythm going. There's so many synthesizers that I tried that when you turn on the arpeggiator and you switch chords, it kind of re-triggers in this glitchy way. And it makes it kind of useless because it's hard for you to change chords as you're playing. But this one is super responsive. So that was the arpeggiator. The sequencer, super cool. It's basically like the SH-101 if you're at all familiar with that. Effectively, it just allows you to program notes quickly as you play them, and then it plays them back right away. I just love this so much. It's so immediate, so quick and fun. There's no menus. You're not there programming for hours. Effectively, it uses the same 3 knobs for the controls, and the rate, again, is just the rate. But the knobs kind of double in meaning. So when you're in sequencer mode here, again, the same controls for direction. You have order. So it remains the order at which it was programmed. Then you have forwards and backwards, so it'll kind of ping pong. And then you have random where it'll randomize. And then you have, instead of the octave controls, you actually have 3 different slots to store sequencers, and you can store up to 256 steps in each one. When you're in record mode, you have tie, rest, and accent. So you actually add accents to different steps, and you can add rests, which effectively adds a blank note in that slot. And then tie, which allows you to add kind of a tie between, like a legato between notes. Switch record, it starts recording. So let me just demo everything. I can play some notes. And it's just gonna wait for you to record so you don't have to rush or worry about how you're playing it. So let's add a rest. Let's maybe add some accents. And then maybe a tie. I have no idea what I just played, but let's hear it anyways. Although it's gonna get boring pretty fast unless I transpose it. Let me turn this down so I can talk. So again, I added some accents, but like I said, you can't hear them until you patch something into that velocity out. So let's do that now. So you can hear the notes where I added the accents are the ones that open the filter with this really quick envelope. Run this through the attenuator first, and then patch it into my cutoff frequency. And now I have control over how much the filter will open when the accents come in. I can turn this up a little bit. That basically summarizes this section up here. Then you have at the top here, obviously the keyboard velocity out, which I'm using for the accent, but you can also use that to patch the velocity of the actual keyboard. I don't know if you can hear that, but the faster I'm pressing the key, the more the filter opens up. Of course, you can patch it to other things like pulse width modulation. And then you have the gate output from the keyboard and the pitch output from the keyboard. So this is useful if you want to control some other synth. There's a bunch of different jacks in the back that I'm not going to cover in this video. I'll do that separately. All right, finally here we have the glide mode and the pitch wheel standard controls. And the default range is 2 semitones up and down, but you can actually change this in the settings to go plus or minus 12. And I say settings, and you might be wondering where. There's no menu, there's nothing. There's some key combination you press that turns it into settings mode, and then these keys turn into different settings. Anyways, none of the settings are critical for using the synth itself. It's more kind of small tweaks that you do once in a while, like setting the MIDI channel and like the range of the pitch wheel here. And then here we have glide, which just kind of adds slew between 2 different notes. And the max value, and I'm going to demonstrate here. That that's really slow. And the other sort of hidden feature is you can turn legato glide on, which I kind of hinted on before. What this means is that instead of glide being always between every note, it'll only be on when you play legato notes. You hold, and then you turn glide to the right to turn legato glide on, and you turn it to the left to turn it off. So if I hold this, no glide. If I play a note and I press another note while holding that note, glide. Oh yeah, the other thing is you can switch octaves. So since this keyboard is tiny, if you want to reach a larger range, you just press, or you hold shift, which is the middle button, and then you press left or right. So if I go to 4 foot, now I'm in the maximum octave. Watch your dogs. Okay, that wasn't so bad. And then we can go to the 32 foot and jump all the way down. So this will be the lowest note. So watch your cats. That's cool. You're basically hearing the clicks of the waveform. You're not even perceiving it as pitch. Let's see at what point we get pitch. Oh, it's starting. It's like we're starting a motorcycle. Here we go. And finally, there's this tap tempo button. So this applies to the arpeggiator and sequencer. So if I turn on the arpeggiator now, if I tap tempo, and then to exit that, you just hold tap again, and then you're back out. The other thing is that it will sync to MIDI clock. So if you have a MIDI going in, the arpeggiator and sequencer will sync, and then this knob turns into like note divisions, eighth note, quarter note, stuff like that. All right, that was a lot of content. Hopefully all of that made sense. Hopefully you get an idea of roughly what the synth can do. There's so much here that it's hard to unpack everything and make it musical and fun and entertaining and informative all in one video, which is why I'm going to do a whole series of videos on this thing. This one was just bird's eye view. In the future, I'm going to focus more on musical ideas, and then some I'll do more patch making stuff, and then tips and tricks. There's just so much here. It's like such a dense synth, and you wouldn't think given how small it is. Yeah, I'm also gonna I'm not gonna bore you in this video because it's already getting really long, but I'll do a separate video where I'm just talking out loud in terms of my thoughts on it, my first impressions, my thoughts on the quality of it, where it fits in the market, and all that kind of stuff. So stay tuned for all that. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.